WVVA in Focus, a weekly program about important issues and events in the two Virginias.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this edition of In Focus. This morning, we are putting the spotlight on retired Chief Warrant Officer 5, Michael Gwinn. He's a Greenbrier County man who was recently inducted into the Army Aviation Hall of Fame in Alabama. And a picture of Gwinn is now on permanent display in the Army Aviation Association Hall of Fame, and that's at Fort Rucker, Alabama. So this morning, we're going to talk to Gwinn and his wife, Kelly, about this recognition and learn more about Gwynn's life and about his parents. They're well known. But first, let's take a look at a story our Annie Moore did recently.
On any given day, you might find Michael Gwinn mowing the lawn here at the Hinton-Alderson Airport in Pence Springs. If you ask him about his life, he'll tell you about his family and friends and their accomplishments. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll learn he was recently inducted into the Army Aviation Hall of Fame.
I never thought I would be living and be able to say I'm in a museum, but I'm in a museum now.
In 1993, 19 soldiers lost their lives in the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia. But it was Gwynn's work in helping to create the military's first ISR technology that helped those on the ground get out.
That whole entire battle, I was beaming video to the people on the ground from a helicopter so that they could use it to try to do everything we had to do there.
The technology was the precursor to the drone technology used to capture Osama bin Laden. The association says Gwinn also helped to develop the tactics and techniques in aviation that are still widely used in covert operations today.
And I developed a lot of the tactics and procedures that were used and are still being used, frankly, for the 160th Special Operation Aviation Regiment now.
While some of Gwynn's work is publicized, the association says many of his accomplishments remain classified and shrouded in mystery. Here for you in Pence Springs, I'm Annie Moore, WVVA News.
All right, thank you, Annie, for that story. And again, a picture of Gwinn along with a detailed account of his accomplishments are now on permanent display at the Army Aviation Association Hall of Fame in Fort Rucker, Alabama. Mr. Gwinn and his wife, Kelly, join us right now in the studio. Mr. Gwinn, how does it feel to be recognized in this way? As you said, you never imagined that you'd be in a museum. How does it feel?
It was surprising. I know that, when it first came out, there was a lot of discussion over the years that, maybe I should be inducted into the Hall of Fame. But my whole career is not as visible as a lot of other people's. And a lot of the members of the Hall of Fame, the people that have been inducted are generals and major people in industry and that type of thing. I'm a warrant officer, a chief warrant officer in the Army, and I think right now there's 178 total people that have ever been inducted into the Army Aviation Hall of Fame, and I was the 36th warrant officer, so there's not very many warrant officers inducted into it. And so, I really thought, especially after I retired and came back here in 2020, when we came back, my wife and I talked about it, and little did I know that she was kind of involved with some people in the background because they were getting some information, but I'm really not supposed to know anything about it, and they contacted us about just a few days before Christmas this past year, and I got a phone call and they said, hey, you're being inducted in the Hall of Fame in April, and so we went on from there, and it's an honor, and it was exciting. It was fun too,
Yeah, well, and thank you for your service as well.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
And Kelly, can you share more about your role in your husband's, I guess, getting him involved with the Hall of Fame and what you had to do behind the scenes? And like he said, he couldn't really know about it.
Some of the former soldiers that he served with contacted me and said, okay, Kelly, we're going to put Mike up for the Hall of Fame, but we're going to need some help. And so they would just send me emails and say, tell me this date and what he did here and where he served here and where he served there. And it had been going on probably for about 6 or 7 months before, and I'm trying to answer all of his questions. And so I'm sneaking in the computer and looking at, history that we have and trying to, put everything together so that I could give it to them.
Okay, well, that's wonderful that you were able to help them, though, provide the information that they needed. And also, the Army Aviation Association of America's website says that Gwynn's breadth of Army aviation experience is truly amazing. In fact, we have some video I'd like to share with the viewers now. In his 43 years of aviation service as a Special Operations Aviator, Troop Commander, Fixed and Rotary Wing Standardization Instructor Pilot, and Army Special Operations Contract Instructor Pilot, he has achieved 12 FAA aircraft type ratings and flown more than 15,000 flight hours, 3,500 with night vision goggles, and 2,000 in combat. That is impressive.
Well, thank you.
So share with us more about your career and what
Well,
you think.
I was fortunate. You know, I grew up here, and my mom was a flight instructor, Ruth Kelly Gwinn. And so from an early age, I was just always around airplanes, you know, and I love airplanes, and I grew up, but I went to college a little bit to Marshall, and I just didn't have my head into what I wanted to do in life, and I really kind of wanted to go in aviation, that type of, that direction. And I enlisted in the Army to go to the flight school, but it took a couple years to get into the flight school, and then I got into flight school and went to flight school and came out. Well, in the process of that, or during that time frame, I was already a civilian flight instructor for airplanes, and had a bunch of civilian ratings. And so when I came in and came out of flight school, went to Fort Campbell, they quickly kind of leveraged that, and several people mentored me and thought I could be an instructor pilot. And so I went down to Fort Rucker and I challenged the course, which means I basically showed up and said, here I am, and I want to try to be an instructor pilot. And I was only a W-1 at that time, a junior warrant officer, and that was really unheard of for anybody doing that. But I had a guy at Fort Campbell, his name was C.W. Weiss, and at that time he was the standardization officer of the cab I was in, and he thought I could do it, and I did it. I became an instructor pilot, so that kind of put me ahead of my peers. And then 2 years later, right when I made CW2, during that time frame, the 160th, which is now called the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Well, then it was created after the Iran crisis that happened over there, and it was a task force, and that's what it was called. And I really wanted to go there, and I got accepted right in. They took me right in, and I was young and I was junior, but I did well there, and so I had a lot of opportunity, and I had a lot of people help me, and I was flying helicopters during that time. And then later on, I was there for 8 years doing that, and then later on I left and continued in special operations, but did things that were outside of that, flying both airplanes and helicopters for the Army and that type of thing. So it was a great career. And in 1988, I went to I was assigned as a liaison officer to a SEAL unit out in Virginia, and that's where I met Kelly. So I also attribute that to me meeting my wife there, so that was a good thing.
Right, good timing, and that was meant to be. So you all have been together for 33 years of marriage?
Yes, yeah, 33 years, yeah.
Okay, so Kelly, I'll have some questions for you about your husband's deployment and what that was like, and about your parents as well, Mr. Gwinn.
Okay.
So we'll definitely talk about that. We have to take a quick break, though. We'll be right back after this. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to this edition of In Focus. This morning, we've been talking to Mr. Michael Gwinn and his wife, Kelly. He's been inducted into the Army Aviation Hall of Fame down in Fort Rucker, Alabama. And also, I would like to talk about the background of your parents. So you're no stranger to the aviation industry.
No.
Not at all. Let's talk first about your father, Colonel John W. Gwinn. Tell us about him.
Well, my dad actually, he was not initially the pilot. My mom was the pilot, and through her grandfather, but they got married in 1938, and my mom was already a flight instructor. And then, and my dad had gone to college from West Virginia, Wesleyan. He had a college degree, and he was in Talcott as a coach and a math teacher at the high school, at the school there, right? In little old Talcott, West Virginia. And World War II started. And when World War II started, he had two brothers that were already in the military, and he was 27 at that time, and he didn't have to go in. had one child, a son at that time, and but he went down right after Pearl Harbor and enlisted. And what they did was they found out he had a degree. They sent him to OCS for Officer Candidate School, and after that they sent him to Navigator School. So he became a navigator in B-25s, and he served almost 3 total years in the South Pacific during the war. So he was over there in Iwo Jima and all over through that. And at the end of the war, my mom and my dad talked about it, and he was a captain then, and they decided it would be good for them for him to stay in, right? And so he stayed in the service. He ended up going to Korea, but then they went to Japan, and then I was actually born in Chicago, right? Which is kind of interesting because both my parents are from Summers County, but people always say, well, you grew up in West Virginia. I did grow up here, but I was born in Chicago, right? And everybody thinks I'm a Yankee, but anyway, but that was, but Dad went through all of that process, and he was a colonel, and he came back to West Virginia, and a lot of people know of the bunker at White Sulphur, right? And I never knew this until very late in his life. He passed away in 2014 at 99. But the whole reason he got the opportunity, came back, was because of that bunker, and they were talking about the airport, right? And that was a whole process was involved in that. And so he came back and was involved in the whole thing. And then, you know, the Greenbrier Valley Airport was, you know, he went through the procurement of the land, oversaw the management of the construction, and then managed it for 24 years. So that was kind of his thing there. So
right, he made his way back, and you were born in Chicago, made your way back to, to West Virginia as well. Now, also, let's talk about your mom, Mrs. Ruth Kelly Gwinn. She was one of the first licensed female aviators in West Virginia, and from what I understand, she taught you how to fly?
Oh yeah, she taught me, and the story I told it at my at the Hall of Fame. In fact, I said this because when I was 16 years old, 50 years ago this month actually, because it was in July 7th of 1972, she soloed me at the little airport in Penn Springs, Hinton-Alderson Airport. And that's where she had her flight school, and my grandfather, James Tolley, had run that school and taught my mom to fly. But anyway, she soloed me, and when so we went around the pattern together, and then she stopped the plane's still running, she got out of it, and she says, okay, you're gonna solo. She said, I want you to go 3 times around the pattern, 3 landings, last landing, I want you to taxi in. And she said, and then she looked at me and she goes, don't do anything stupid.
I guess you heeded her advice, right?
Yeah, exactly. My whole life, I've been trying to do that. You know, so.
Right, I was going to say most parents are just telling their kids when they're teenagers, like, clean your room, and your mom's like, go ahead, you're going to solo, you're going to go around, you're going to do this.
Yeah.
How did your mom get involved with flying in the first place?
Well, my grandfather, James Tolley, he was a pilot in the late 20s, early 30s, and then he opened the airport at Pitt Springs, and he was teaching people to fly, and my mom was one of the very first students he had. He taught her to fly, she soloed, she became a private pilot, a commercial pilot, and an instructor. And when World War II started, my grandfather had a flight school here at Princeton, well, not here, but at Princeton, and also at he used the airport at Hinton-Alderson as like a satellite field for these people to fly, and they had Piper Cubs, and my mom was an instructor in that. And so the entire war, what they would do is bring the cadets in there, they would train for 20 hours, and then from there they would either get washed out or they would go fly bombers or fighters, right? And they were the next thing they did after 20 hours of flight time. And my mom was always instructor, and there's a great YouTube video of her talking about that on YouTube, because they had interviewed her for a thing that happened about 15 years ago, and she was talking about it because, you know, there were no women, she was the only woman at all doing this at that time anywhere in these schools, and so it was very unusual, you know.
Right, just go on YouTube, and I've watched that video that Mr. Gwynn's talking about his mom, and it's a first-hand account from her, so if you type Ruth Gwinn in YouTube, it should come right up for you to watch. So Kelly, talk more about what it's been like being deployed with your husband and the Black Hawk Down incident in '93 in Somalia.
Yeah. When Mike and I were first together, I can't begin to tell you how many of his commanders would come up and say, he's the best pilot I've ever flown with. Wow. You know, I mean, I heard it so many times that I finally started believing it.
Yeah.
So I always had a lot of faith in his abilities and his skills, and he would deploy to places that sometimes I could know about and sometimes I couldn't. And with the situation with Somalia, when at that point my son was 3 years old, and in August he said, I gotta go, and I said, okay. And I was always very comfortable with that until they started dragging the soldiers' bodies through the streets of Somalia. That was hard to watch. That's when it became more real to me, I think. And then we, on October 2nd, it was October 2nd in the States, but it was October 3rd where he was. And my son's birthday is October 2nd, and Mike's birthday is October 3rd.
Oh, wow.
So we ended up that day getting a satellite call. That was back in the day. There was no FaceTime or cell phones or, you know, none of that. So it's one of those where you talk and you have to hold it, you talk, and then you say over, and then you have to let go, and that's such a hot mess because, you know, nobody really knows how to use those.
Right.
But we had a great call. Went home with a bunch of my girlfriends, Army wives, whose husbands were over there too, had a birthday party for my son. And I was in teacher school at the time. I was getting certified to teach. And so I went to class the next day, and on the ride home, I had the news on the radio, and I just sat there and went, you've got to be kidding me, because at that point, it had all happened. You know, it was not over quite yet, but it had all happened. And it was frightening. Yeah. To say the least. And so I came home, and my answer machine was buzzing, and I got a call from his unit that said, her name was Alice, and she says, Kelly, this is Alice. She goes, just want to let you know Mike is fine, and you take care.
Wow.
Yeah.
What were you thinking at that moment? Was it just like, oh, relief and...
Relief, but still, you know, what do? You turn the news on, and you sit there 24/7 looking at the news, and just wanting more information, but not really wanting more information, you know? So it's terrifying. And that was, you know, back in 1993. So since then, we've seen so many, you know, with the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and just the heart that I have for these women who have to do it. I mean, obviously the men are making such great sacrifices, but it's hard on those women back home.
What do you think is the most challenging part for the women? Is it the unknowns, just not knowing and not being able to communicate, especially when something horrific is happening and you see it on the news?
That's it. I mean, now we've got the beauty now of FaceTime, and that happens. You know, when my son, you know, he would deploy all the time, and I was fine. But when my son deployed to Afghanistan, you know, there was not enough hair dye to keep my hair the right color, because it was going gray fast, because it was frightening, you know. That's, but he would FaceTime us regularly. So it's better now than it was back then. You don't have as much of the unknown until the big news blast comes on, and all of a sudden you realize something's happening and you're not talking to him. And then you're just sitting there waiting. That's all you can do.
It's better in a way, but it's also hard in a way, I think, because you know, really, Mogadishu was probably the first time that video was coming into the American public that fast, you know, and it was like virtually in real time in certain situations coming in. And when that news was coming back, it was, you know, the shock was right there in front of people. But, you know, when we went over there at that time, you know, prior to that, I had been gone for 6-7 weeks, I guess, at that time over there, and we had only had a couple of very sparse letters, and they were all messed up, the timeline, you know, like my letter was 3 letters behind your letter and that type of thing, and so we had no communication. And then we had this one phone call, which when we talked, it was 2 a.m. where I was, and I went to sleep and then got up, and then that was the day everything happened, you know, so that's how that timeline. But, you know, talking about today, to be overseas, and I was in Afghanistan and Iraq too, and we could talk virtually daily, you know, and that was something that, you know, was unheard of 15 years ago. But the bad thing about that is, and this was really true of our son, because when our son, and it hit me the other side of it, you know, I was on the other side of the whole thing, because Kelly and I are at home, and he's deployed to Afghanistan. And he had to all of a sudden, we were able to talk to him virtually every day. Every day we were hearing from him, and then all of a sudden it stopped, right? And he had to go somewhere. He's an infantryman. He had to go somewhere for 3 weeks. And we never heard a word. And, you know, and that was rough. It was almost bad that you had this routine connection and now it was cut off, right? And Kelly's like, to me, she goes, you know people, you call somebody and find out where he is. And I said, Kelly, I mean, come on. I mean, he's in the infantry, he's in the Army.
Only so much you can
this is what you do. But that was hard. That was tough.
Yeah.
And it was very a glaring example of it's almost, in a way, there's almost too much communication, you know, and sometimes. But it's good. It's better than no communication.
Right, and better than in the early 90s. All right, we have to take one more quick break. Much more to talk about. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to this edition of In Focus, everyone. We're joined again with Mr. Michael Gwinn and his wife, Kelly. And Mr. Gwinn has been inducted into the Army Aviation Hall of Fame down in Fort Rucker, Alabama. So this morning we've been learning a lot about Mr. Gwinn's career, his accomplishments. We've heard from Kelly about her firsthand account of being married to Mr. Gwinn and dealing with life of him being deployed. So, Mr. Gwinn, out of everything that you've done in your career, what would you say that you are most proud of?
Okay, I would say that I'm most proud of the fact that I was, throughout my career, an instructor. And I'm most proud of the fact that I've taught a lot of people. And one of them, for instance, is General McConville, the Chief of Staff of the Army. Now, I taught him when he was a captain and then a major, and not initially taught him to fly. I taught him tactics, procedures, different aircraft, things like that. And so what I'm proud about is that I think that a lot of those people have been safe and effective, and I think I helped in that, and that's what I'm proud of, you know.
And Kelly, what do you think that your husband's legacy will be?
You know, just the fact that he was, that he is an incredible patriot, that he is an incredible aviator, and an incredible teacher. He's touched a lot of lives.
Yeah. And Mr. Gwinn, what would you say, like, what characteristics does it take for someone to be successful in any branch of the military, would you say? Like, what types of personal characteristics does it take to endure?
Well, integrity, I think, is important. And just the sheer fact that, you know, you can have fun and you can have a good time, but you do need to be professional. And I probably think one of the biggest traits in the military is everybody in the military at one time is in charge and everybody follows, right? You know, and so, you know, even generals have somebody they report to, right? And there's a time to, I had a good friend of mine, Kelly and I, who's a retired four-star general, but when he was lieutenant colonel, he said a thing that I always thought was true and important, because he said, there's a time to comment and disagree and discuss, but then there's a time to fall in behind and go and do it, you know, like that. And so, and it's true, because you should be able to have a discussion of what it is you're trying to do and how the best way to do it. But everybody who needs to be able to lead, but you also need to be able to be a good follower, you know, and you do. And sometimes people have a hard time dealing with that, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's a good life lesson anyway, is like there's a saying, seek first to understand, then be understood, like to listen actively and then, you know, come to a point of discussion after that. So those are great life lessons, I think, as well. Kelly, what advice would you offer to a military spouse out there who might be watching this morning, or maybe someone who's about to enter a military family?
To make sure that you surround yourselves with the other wives, you know, build that community and be a part of that community, because when things get rough, that's where you need to be, with those other wives, and it gets you through it. It really does. And it's, you know, it's just that common ground. You know, we're all experiencing the same thing, have the same fears. And I think that that is really the key. That's what got me through. I had, you know, lifelong friends that were there with me the whole time. And sometimes their husbands were there and sometimes they weren't, but we were always there for each other.
Right, and as you said, lifelong connections too.
Absolutely.
And Mr. Gwinn, I think I heard you mention in one of the segments previously that you had given a speech at the Army Aviation Hall of Fame.
Yes.
Is that correct?
I was, when they induct you, you stand up and you're supposed to give they want you to say a few words.
Okay, so we have just a little bit of time left, but I'm just curious, what did it feel like giving that speech as you're being honored there in Alabama?
Well, actually, the induction was actually in Nashville at the Gaylord Hotel, because they have a big convention there every year, and that's when they do it. Now, the museum is in Alabama. But,
Okay.
Well, an interesting thing about that speech is the Quad A and the people that run it, and one person in particular is a lady named Janice Arena, and she's very sharp. She knows exactly what's going on with this stuff. But I asked her how long I should speak, and she said, "Oh, just 1 or 2 minutes." And I was talking to several other people that I know, and another person that I know that also was already inducted in the Hall of Fame. And I said, "How long did you speak up there?" They told me 1 or 2 minutes, and he goes, "Look, there's a lot of people there that know you that are going to be sitting there, and you can't get up there and just talk for 1 or 2 minutes."
And I hate to cut you off, but we have run out of time. I'm so sorry. We're going to have to interview you again sometime. Thank you both for coming into this edition of In Focus. Appreciate it. That does it for us. We hope you have a great day.